Welcome to the Harvesting Wisdom podcast. Together we explore the vast landscapes of life, delving into the rich soil of experiences, sowing the seeds of curiosity, and harvesting the profound wisdom that each episode unfolds.
Hi, my name is Dr. Joe Roselle. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Urban Farming Education and the host today for Harvesting Wisdom. Super excited to be here today. Today's conversation focuses on biomass carbon removal for negative greenhouse gas emissions with Tom Richard from Penn State. We are. Love to have him on the show today. We're exploring the climate change and the work that this is trying to solve, the science and systems thinking that makes biomass carbon removal important, and the practical steps needed to turn promising ideas into real-world impact. So Tom, before we get started, I just threw out a bunch of mumbo jumbo. Talk to me about just the Reader's Digest version. What is biomass and removal, and why is it so important?
Well, I think all of your audience knows that there's a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, too much, more every day. But what many of them may not realize is that carbon dioxide is actually part of a balancing act that the Earth's plant life and animals have been carrying on for about 3 billion years. And plants, of course, through photosynthesis, take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to make their carbon molecules that then we as animals eat. And then we respire that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere through our metabolism and other organisms, fungi and the soil biology, the composting systems all are doing that respiration as well, decomposing that plant material. And that carbon cycle between plants and photosynthesis and animals and bacteria and respiration happens at a huge scale. Every year, plants take up 10 times as much carbon dioxide as all of our fossil fuel emissions combined. So this is already happening and has happened for a long time and has accumulated carbon in the soil and geologic formations. In fact, all that carbon that we're pulling out as fossil energy was once plant biomass, right? And so what we're trying to do is harness that natural process. And we have two really broad and basic strategies. One is to increase the amount of photosynthesis, and the other is to reduce the amount of respiration. And people have been doing the former for quite a long time. All of agriculture is about how to get more photosynthesis to happen, right? And crop yields have been increasing for centuries. We have made some errors. We've cut down a lot of forests that had a lot of stored carbon. We plowed the land and degraded a lot of soil carbon, but we understand those natural processes a lot better now, and we can do a lot to better manage that part of the carbon cycle. But biomass carbon removal is primarily about slowing down or stopping respiration. So how can we take some of that carbon that we're managing in agriculture and forestry and put it in places where it will not decompose? And again, some of that we've been doing for a long time, like wooden buildings that are sometimes hundreds of years old. So that is stored carbon, right? Heirloom furniture. But there are new things as well, biochar. So intentionally charring woody materials so that they don't decompose as readily. There's a lot of interest in wood for timber structures that are not just 1 or 2 story buildings, but skyscrapers. So mass timber construction that can substitute for concrete and steel. And already there are 20-story buildings being built where their structural components are wood. And by the way, those are more safe from fire and other kinds of disasters than concrete and steel, believe it or not, because when wood is burned, it chars. And in a hot fire, the oxygen can't get through that char. Whereas in a hot fire, steel can melt and you can have building collapse like we've seen in a few real big disasters. So, and then there's some really more large scale options. For example, there's a lot of geologic formations here in the US and around the world that have porosity that is either filled with air or is filled with saltwater solutions deep in the ground, and where we can inject carbon dioxide under pressure a mile down or more, and it will actually be a liquid under those pressures, and it will slowly mineralize to rock, and over time it will become rocks that we might recognize as calcium carbonate or limestone, right? And there are many other carbonate rocks. That's just a really common one. But even while it's mineralizing, it's stored at high density and with very low leakage rates, and can be there for thousands of years. And we can take CO2 that's being emitted from a power plant, but we can also take CO2 that's coming out of some bioprocess that has been more recently carbon in the atmosphere and that plants have captured. And that could be, for example, the fermentation gas from an alcohol facility, a distillery, or an ethanol biofuel facility. I'm doing a lot of work with renewable natural gas, and there's also carbon dioxide that comes off of that process, along with methane, which we'd recognize as fossil natural gas. And those concentrated CO2 streams can be injected deep into the ground. And then there's also things that are maybe sound a little bit more crude, but we can bury biomass, sealing it up in plastic so that oxygen can't get to it and moisture can't get to it and it can't decompose, and essentially build landfills with biomass to store carbon for a long, long period of time. So variety of different options, some old, some new, all of which put together can really have a huge impact in terms of mitigating our climate, not just reducing emissions, but actually reversing emissions so that we can over time start to get back to a better climate like we had decades ago.
So this is interesting. So for me, and I want to make sure I understand it, so I'm going to try to boil it down. So basically, we're looking at the system as a whole, and part of the process is that some products, they off gas, and that's what you're looking to do. Or when they decompose, they're sending out harmful CO2. So just by changing the processing, you can actually change what gases get released. Is that an accurate oversimplification of what we're talking about here?
That's correct. And most often we're interested in waste gases or things that we have thought about as waste gases, and capturing those and taking advantage of them. But there are also solid materials, solid waste, residues, things like that. What we really need to start getting our heads around is photosynthesis is capturing all that carbon for us already.
Mm-hmm.
Humans are managing about half of photosynthesis on the planet between forestry and agriculture. How can we really, using our harvesting wisdom, to keep track of those carbon molecules and not just release them to the atmosphere, but to put them in places where they will be permanently stored so that we can actually keep them out of the atmosphere?
So it kind of sounds like when we look at specific industries, and we can dive into that now, it's just a matter of processing your waste or thinking about how you're processing the whole product stream from when you harvest it to how you dispose of it. Just to get some more clarity, what are some of the innovations for agriculture? I'm sure that this is a big part of agriculture on a farm, or whether it's small scale, large scale. What are some of the innovative ways that people are processing or changing their habits to capture more carbon throughout this process?
Yeah. So first of all, there are these natural systems and natural solutions like storing carbon in the soil or in forests that we have been doing more and more of. And soil carbon and accumulating soil carbon is a really smart thing to do. It's going to improve soil health. It's going to improve the resilience of soils and their crops to things like drought, as well as flooding. And farmers have been trying to improve soil health again for decades. And one of the best ways to do that is to build soil carbon. So that can be by things like planting cover crops, making sure that residues get returned to the land, using compost and manure and other organic waste materials and stabilizing them so they can go back and build soil organic matter. And so that's sort of one area. And there's a similar opportunity and story in the forest to manage forest production in ways that build soil carbon over time. And forests themselves are stored carbon, right? All those trees are about half carbon in their weight. And so that's a great place to store carbon, except they might burn in a fire. They might be killed by a beetle or some other insect or a pathogen. So some of these disruptive changes to our forests are a little bit harder to manage. Even though forest carbon looks like a great option, it's a bit more risky. And to some extent, that's true for soil carbon as well, because you might have a farmer that's doing sustainable practices now, but their land may pass to someone else, and they may start doing a less climate smart practice on the farm and start mining that soil carbon right now. And it can take 30 or 40 years to build up soil carbon in the soil, and it only takes 3 or 4 years to take it back down again. So unfortunately, those natural systems are just a bit more risky. The larger scale, or I should say more, I'm an engineer, so we'll say more engineered systems, like using the plant biomass in woody materials, making biochar out of it, storing carbon dioxide underground requires putting down pipes and pressurizing and things like that. Those are more technically complicated and not as easy to do on an individual farm, but they're also much more durable. And of course, in climate change, we like to think about 100-year time scales. And so some of those other methods are proven or more durable for that 100 to 1,000-year time scale that we really need. They're not as easy to do on farms, but I'll give you one example. So compost produces carbon dioxide. There's some really interesting new innovative composting technologies to capture that carbon dioxide. You need to have your composting in a building, but it's possible. Renewable natural gas or anaerobic digestion that I'm doing a lot of work with now produces carbon dioxide. So we can take that carbon dioxide and at a local scale, inject it into cement at the local concrete operation. And what's interesting about that is when cement is made, there's this process of baking limestone in a kiln to actually drive off some of the carbon. So limestone I mentioned a little while ago was calcium carbonate. When we make cement, we take some of that carbon and we drive off CO2 in a kiln. That's one of the reasons concrete is one of the biggest fossil footprint materials we have. But it also means it's chemically unstable and it wants to reabsorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And in fact, if you pour cement, it does that. The problem is it takes decades and hundreds of years to sort of soak back up that carbon dioxide. But if you inject it into the cement as you're mixing it when it's a fluid, then it can take it up right away. And it doesn't weaken the concrete. And in fact, it stabilizes it quicker. And you can move a lot of that locally from a farm scale to as big as you want.
What examples can you find or discuss in the examples that you just talked about on how it's actually cheaper or it's cost neutral? And what I tell everybody, if it's at least cost neutral, why aren't we changing it? And if it's cheaper, then we definitely have to lean into this process because it's helping us be better stewards of the planet. So in agriculture or forestry, like you were just discussing, what are some of the innovations that you just discussed that are actually cheaper or cost neutral?
Well, I do think that the soil carbon accumulation is the lowest cost. And that's partly because it has all these really well documented benefits in terms of crop production, in terms of crop resilience, and it's also most commonly done with things that are considered waste materials, whether that's manure or compost or food waste, et cetera. So those are some advantages. We don't have as many examples of the concentrated carbon dioxide that are cost neutral right now, but anaerobic digestion traditionally has been at a small scale, say a dairy farm or even a municipal wastewater treatment plant. The biogas that's produced, which is about 60% methane and 40% carbon dioxide, that's been burned on site in an engine generator to produce electricity. And the carbon dioxide was never separated from the methane because the engine just ran on a little bit more dilute fuel, and that was cheaper than doing the separation. But over the last decade or so, there's been an increasing market for renewable natural gas. Interesting fact, our electricity grid right now is 40% decarbonized today, a little bit over 40%. Now, half of that is nuclear. Okay, so it's not all solar and wind. Another 10% is hydroelectric, but there's more than 10% solar and wind right now. And 40% is not fossil. Our natural gas grid, which is almost the same scale in terms of how much energy it moves around the country, is less than 0.5% decarbonized. It's almost all fossil. And there are people who are using natural gas, whether in vehicles or home heating or for process heat, that would really like some renewable natural gas. And we have some programs for vehicles which actually support that with some federal cost sharing and incentive programs. So when you make biogas into renewable natural gas, you have a carbon dioxide waste stream. It comes off. You have to do something with it. You can release it to the atmosphere, but a lot of those incentives actually are based on the idea that we want a carbon benefit. And so the costs of actually taking that CO2 waste stream that's already purified, because you had to take it out from the methane, and injecting it into the ground are very low, and there are various markets that are willing to pay for that. To give you an example of the value of that well-documented durable carbon storage, the voluntary marketplace from people that are oftentimes companies that are trying to offset their carbon emissions for say soil carbon or forest carbon, the directly natural ecosystem storage, because of its risks, are only valued at about $25 a ton of carbon. The durable storage in some of these carbon renewable strategies, whether that's in ground or in concrete or in biochar, those are currently priced in the voluntary market at about $250 a ton. So 10 times as valuable because the market is understanding that this is a much more durable, much more permanent storage than some of these other systems. And I think by coupling those natural systems that are managed more sustainably for their carbon benefits, and also these engineered systems, industrial systems, we're going to have solutions that are more cost effective and more profitable for those people that are doing the work.
We've traveled a lot with urban farming education. What we find is, and I've heard this before, that there's not one solution for every community, every part of the world. It just depends. One of the things that we found as far as renewable gas, like you were discussing, we're seeing countries in Africa or underdeveloped countries or rural parts of the United States embracing more sustainable energy. What are you seeing as far as segments of society where people are more embracing this? Just in general, to summarize what I just was saying, I think that the developed parts of the world resist this because they already have an infrastructure that they're committed to, and it would take a large investment to pivot. But rural parts or underdeveloped parts, they don't have to invest in the infrastructure. They can adopt the technology and have something, whether it's cooking or tech or electricity or even communication.
Yeah, great points and great questions. So it's interesting. Again, I don't want to focus entirely on this anaerobic digestion and digesters. That is something I'm doing a lot of work on. It's a good opportunity. What's interesting about that, if you look across the globe, is it's kind of a bimodal distribution. So there are these small sort of household sort of subsistence farmer digesters, millions of them in China, in Southeast Asia, in India. And then there are more it's commercial farm scale systems, tens of thousands in Italy, in Germany, in Denmark, in France, mostly in Europe. Growing numbers in the US, but our incentives have never been as strong for those. So I think really the big benefit of that particular energy technology is that it's what I'll call dispatchable. So solar and wind work great when the sun's shining and the wind is blowing, but not so well other times, right? And batteries are getting cheaper, and that's fantastic. And coupling a battery with solar and wind, or building that other types of storage into the grid, can work really, really well. But in a biogas digester, the digester itself is storing the energy in the gas trapping system, which is sometimes just a little dome, sometimes it's a plastic bag, and that's storing that half a day's worth of gas for that particular household that you were describing. And that can also store it on a larger scale. In our natural gas grid in the United States, because historically we use natural gas a lot for heat in colder parts of the country, we have about a month to a month and a half worth of storage built into that grid. It's in vast underground caverns. And so to have a month worth of battery storage to back up solar and wind electricity, that would be really expensive. But to have the gas storage as renewable natural gas to be dispatchable to help us out through week and month-long cycles, that starts to be really valuable and a lot cheaper than batteries. So anyway, I guess I'm sort of talking about the two scales. There are small scale solutions that work really well, and there are big scale solutions that work really well.
Well, that kind of leads me to my next point. We're seeing a lot more planned communities that are sustainable. There's some here in Tempe and Phoenix that are meant to be for electric cars or for commuters, but we're also seeing larger communities. If somebody was going to hire you to develop a 400 or 500 house community, what are some of the things that you would suggest that they put in place? I'm guessing it would be a digester, but what are some of the things that you would look at as far as landscaping, food production? What are some of the things that you would suggest that these communities put into their, develop as part of their master plan?
Yeah, I think on the land basis, I would really focus on building soil carbon everywhere, and particularly any place where you might be doing food production, because it's going to just have all those benefits we described earlier. And planting trees. Trees have all kinds of benefits, both globally in terms of climate, but also locally in terms of providing shade and cooling and also biodiversity. And I happen to be living in a community of about 30 households on 10 acres, and we've just planted 400 trees this spring and another 400 shrubs. Those shrubs aren't going to accumulate carbon as fast, but they're also going to provide us with a lot of cover and habitat for creatures, birds, small animals, etc. So anyway, I think there's a lot of landscape pieces that you can do. And then I think recycling. Humans, through our food, through our agriculture, through our materials purchases of all kinds of things, from paper to furniture, we're managing a lot of carbon all the time. And thinking more reflectively about what happens to that carbon, where it's going, can we find places where it can contribute to long-term soil carbon storage in the soil through composting? Can we put it into some kind of system where it might produce renewable energy? Or can we find other places where it can be durably stored in some material that people enjoy? I used to joke when I was still had an office at the university, I had about a ton of carbon stored in my file cabinets and bookcases. Thought really hard about that when it was time to move on, and made darn sure that all that carbon got recycled so that people didn't have to cut down trees to produce more paper.
So what do you do with the maintenance part? What do you do with all the waste that's generated with that community? Since we're talking about systems thinking, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think that composting is always going to be a good option for waste materials. I worked with composting for about 20 years before I started doing work with anaerobic digestion, and never stopped composting myself. I do think that there are some other things we should be thinking about. Again, composting is decomposition, and if we're trying to take carbon out of the atmosphere, well, there's a trade-off there, right? So if that compost can stimulate soil carbon storage, then fantastic. But soil eventually will stabilize, and it can't saturate. It'll eventually saturate, and you can't store all the carbon we'd like to in it. So thinking about other things that might be materials that might be usable and that might store carbon a little bit longer. In composting, you want to accelerate decomposition, but if we slow it down by actually doing the reverse of what we might normally do in composting. So instead of getting that carbon nitrogen ratio down to 30-1, let's leave it at 70 or 80 or 100-1 for some of these woody materials and let them decompose much more slowly as a wood chip pathway, for example, or in various types of brush habitat for small animals, things like that. So just thinking again about what are the options for all those molecules of carbon, they're a gift. From plants to us, and we need to think about how to manage those gifts. And there are hundreds of really great ways to do it.
Yeah, and that's the approach that we're taking too. So education for us has been a big piece. As you see the transition in your field, what role does education play, and what's your endpoint? Do you work with schools like we do, or is this something where you're working doing public service announcements? How do you get this word across? Because short of doing a policy recommendation where you make it mandatory or you incentivize it with money, one of the strategies we use a lot is just educating people, and we have seen traction in that as well.
Yeah. So I'm trying to work every scale. I work a lot with high school students. I mentioned in sort of a side comments earlier that I work with an organization called the Global Council for Science and the Environment. And it's been around for more than 30 years. And it's actually, Arizona State was one of our sort of founding and great sponsor organization for the group. Universities partnered to help get good science into the hands of policy people and decision makers at every scale, from government agencies to businesses to individuals. And we have the high school program called Environmentors, which hooks up high school kids, typically from under-resourced high schools, where a lot of kids aren't maybe going to go to college and don't really know what science is like as a career, to plug them into doing environmental research with scientists from a university, graduate students and undergraduates as well, and mentoring them to both try to address and understand some of the scientific problems, oftentimes in their own home communities, because we know that environmental justice is something that impacts under-resourced communities a lot more than others. But also giving these kids an exposure and an opportunity to think about careers in environmental science. So Environmentors, fantastic program. And working with those decision makers, fantastic and important. I am particularly biased towards finding market-based solutions to environmental problems. And one of the things I love about the work on carbon removal is that we're managing this carbon as part of our economy in agriculture, in forestry, and the new bioeconomy around bioproducts of all sorts, from biodegradable plastics to new kinds of pharmaceuticals to new kinds of food and food additives. So getting that community to think more carefully about the carbon that they're already managing is a huge opportunity. And part of that is working with those businesses, but part of that is also working with those businesses' customers. And that means all of us, right? And so trying to get the word out to as many people as possible through opportunities like this and many, many others is where I see my role.
Yeah, honestly, that's an excellent point, because we've worked with some companies that have great innovative products, but when it comes to educating their community, they're at a loss. So what do you think the biggest ally for you is right now, just in general? What group have you seen instrumental in standing side by side by corporations or helping to push this research forward? So I think having a media outlet that embraces this is really important. What have you found as being one of your best allies?
Well, I think the media is absolutely critical in the ways that you've described. But what's interesting, and I would really amplify, is that it's not the reporters themselves. It's finding the peers of each one of us, the respective figures in our lives, right? That we can understand and appreciate and think about as being like us. So elevating their voices is really where the power is. And There's nothing like having someone that you respect say something is important to getting you to think about it really hard and probably change the way you do things. So finding those individuals that are representative and the diverse voices, and helping them to have the information to communicate with their networks to make that impact is also really, really critical. We're in a tough time right now. I am not naive about that. And some of our communication channels have been suffering, for example, public broadcasting and, et cetera, et cetera. But this is also a time where media is much more democratized, and people have access to things like your podcast that can help them. So I think there's a lot of hope and potential in that. And I think as we work on making sure that these stories are understandable to people and helping them see how this can happen in their lives, I think I'm very hopeful. But the other thing that I think is important is we're at a really interesting space now, because a lot of the things that you and I have just been describing are not all that new. Okay. Composting, I was working on 40 years ago, and it wasn't new then. Right. So how do we get these things to get out of being a niche that a small number of committed people are committed to and doing and making happen, to actually being the way our society works? So it's not 5 or 10%; it's 95%.
Well, we could have a full podcast on that. I had a great conversation with somebody on this, and basically, as a society, we're hooked on convenience. I can't tell you how many times I've sat down and talked to somebody, and they're shocked to find out that if they use compost, they could save up to 30% on their water consumption. It's something they need anyway. Plus, it's reimagining how they're using a resource, or what they consider waste as a resource. So, great suggestion for that. I want to follow up or finish up by asking you another simple question, because these answer these questions always shock me. What are the innovations in this space or related spaces that you're the most excited about?
Well, I will first of all just mention and direct your listeners to the Clean Air Task Force, which I've been working with for the last year or so on understanding biomass carbon removal, and particularly looking at the voluntary marketplace and what the different options are, because there's a lot of creative things out there. So some of them are a little bit wild, but burying logs like trees, okay, pressurizing and hydrolyzing woody waste materials into a bio oil, a bio crude. We were used to drawing crude oil out of the ground, but we can put bio crude into the ground. And, and both of those are really low cost carbon removal strategies. They don't necessarily have a market product for a consumer, but some of them can be coupled with market-based processes. For example, burying waste materials from an agricultural or forest products company may well be an interesting option. And again, there's voluntary markets who are willing to pay good money for that part of it to help a business survive overall. So I'm really still looking for the small scale CO2 option beyond the concrete, because there's a lot of places that could use that. There's all those millions of biogas digesters on farms in Southeast Asia that we talked about. But maybe one of your listeners will have a good idea. As you said, these good ideas can come from anywhere.
So that's a great ending point. I really want to thank Tom Richard for being our guest today. And my takeaway from our conversation is purely this. You gave example after example after example. Don't take the current process for granted. There can always be changes. There can always be innovations. And you mentioned something during the podcast, which I think is really important. Really keep your eye on carbon sequestration or carbon removal, and ways to make innovations toward that end. And you're right, the solution can come from anywhere. So if you're out there and you want to be connected with Tom, or you have suggestions for innovations or exciting processes that we didn't mention, please make sure to add a comment. The projects that Tom talked about during the podcast will be linked below. Please make sure to like and subscribe. And I want to thank Tom for being our guest today, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining the Harvesting Wisdom podcast. Click subscribe and like for ongoing insightful conversations. Explore our webpage for show notes and additional resources. Visit our guests' webpage for deeper insights. Your engagement is the foundation of our journey, and until next time, keep pursuing wisdom.